Welcome to the latest video from the Watercolors Aquarium Gallery, coming to you from the Aquarium Rush Studios in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So often you hear us geek out on topics and really get into the science of those topics. Where do we get all that information? We don't find a lot of that information accurately on a lot of what we would say the traditional websites are that we go for information. In fact, we even have a whole video about misinformation on some very popular sites. Where we do find a lot of the good information, let me rephrase that a little bit, where Charles finds a lot of the good information for us is through scientific papers.
Yeah. So as my it's so fancy. As my example of the paper I'm going to go through here and point out all this stuff, the title is called The Effect of Group Size on Behavior and Welfare of Four Fish Species Commonly Kept in Home Aquaria.
Oh, I'm sorry, what?
The point of that being, when I tell you a minimum group size, I'm using actual science. I'm not just some random answer, okay?
He takes it very personally. Yeah, that's probably the hardest thing to start is when the title is about something so interesting and it sounds really boring.
Yes, but the point of scientific writing is that it's very precise and very, that makes it dense though.
Yes, yeah.
A lot of information with no fluff.
Yeah.
Right.
So starting off with, before I get into the nitty-gritty details of reading a paper, how do you find a paper?
Yeah.
Google Scholar is your best friend. It's a search engine for scientific literature and stuff like that. So if you were going to say, I want to look up information on this kind of fish let's say we're going to look up...
Let's say this paper right here.
Yeah, let's say this paper right here. In here there are going to be tiger barbs and angelfish and neon tetras. So if you want to find a paper on neon tetras, I would recommend finding the scientific name, which is Parachirodon denisei, and then type that in, and then you can sort through that however you want. Google Scholar allows you to sort by, I only want papers written in this time frame, or
Nice.
You can organize it by relevancy or whatever you're looking for and hone it down that way.
The big thing for me is a lot of scientific journals do want you to pay for their content. They've got great reasons for that, but as hobbyists, we're not always willing or able to do that. And they will let you filter by that as well.
I would recommend not doing that because there is a really easy workaround for that. And then the fun part is it's completely legal and actually it's really fun.
Okay.
So if you go to the authors in Google Scholar, it will load you up to automatically, like, because they're scientific institutes, to their work email.
Okay.
Scientific authors don't get paid for printing rights. So they have zero incentive not to hand out their scientific literature out for free if you ask for it.
Excellent. So you're still going directly to the source.
You go directly to the author and ask,
Very cool.
I would like to read your paper on XYZ. Can you send me a PDF file? The only reason I have not gotten a response is I found out later that he was going through a divorce and wasn't checking his work email.
So then not only are you getting an actual scientific paper, you're also starting a dialogue with the scientists who did the study.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and scientists, generally speaking, do research like this because they want that knowledge to be out there.
Yes. And if you have questions, be respectful, but they can be pretty nice about it. Like the Smeridina paper, that author, he sent me, I asked him a few questions about his paper, and he sent back like annotated notes for me
That's
to go
amazing.
back through into the paper and understand it as a person who did not know about like in-depth metagenetics.
People want to share information.
Yeah.
That's great.
So you found your paper, what do you do with it now?
Right.
So I think I should start off with, how do you know that you found a good paper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's printed in a peer-reviewed journal, like Nature, or in this case, it's Applied Animal Behavior Science, keep a wary eye on things red flags are if the author has to pay to get published. Those are a red flag.
Okay.
If you go in Google Scholar, if you hover over a person's writing history and if you click on it, I don't want to get into specific details in this video, but let's say that there was a recent media thing that when I looked into the source of that information, his bibliography included like 2,000 papers. Let me tell you, that is impossible to do.
It was time to write 2,000 papers
without any sort of validity.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that immediately tells me he's not looking at what he's writing. What he's probably doing is slapping his name on people that he's not paying attention to what they're doing.
Yeah, scientific writing is inherently slow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good author, good publisher, those are going to be your best go-tos to figure out what's going on there. Okay, you've got a good paper.
Yeah.
You're ready to read it. Let's
Yep.
move on. The first section is the abstract. So that's going to be in this paper. It's right there. The abstract in most cases, for most people, I feel like the abstract is about as far as you need to go
Really?
because it is...
It's basically a summary, right?
Yes,
Okay.
but unlike the summary that you would find in a book and stuff, that they have to give all the plot points.
Yeah. Spoilers are okay in this
It's
kind
not
of
a
paper.
teaser.
No,
It's a summary.
It's a summary, and a
Yeah.
good abstract should tell you the bullet points of everything that's going to be covered in the paper. And if it doesn't, it's a bad abstract.
Yeah, and I will say oftentimes even paid papers, I would say actually more often than not have the abstract available whether or not you can read through the full thing.
Yep.
So you can still get really good information, especially if you just need an idea.
Yep.
Sure.
Yeah.
The next section is going to be the introductions. The nice thing about introductions is that if you're first being introduced into a topic, this is going to be the section where they're talking about this is the built on science, and the end of the introduction is this is where we're trying to add on to that.
Okay.
So it's a great way to get a crash course into what people know at the time. If you're reading a recent paper on a topic, the first part of their paper is describing, so this is the scientific data so far, here are the implications, so we're trying to add to that and see if we can tweak it. Pretty cool, pretty fun.
I like it.
The next section is either going to be called methods or materials and methods in this case. That's going to be a breakdown of their process for the structuring of their stuff. So this
How they did the study.
Yeah, how they did the study. This one's broken down into experimental animals, so it's talking about the species that they're working with, how they're different from each other, the types of tanks they kept them in, and then it goes on to explain how they collected data, what kind of data they were collecting. This is the part that gets really technical.
Yeah, and if you're like me and don't have the attention span always to completely read all of these sections, I'm going to skim through most of that and go to the stuff that's later on.
I will talk about this paper real quick as a preview to get people to maybe try and find this paper and read it, or maybe listen to me when I reference it. There's a specific section called ethical note, and this was basically an idea of to do research on vertebrates, you need to pass an ethical committee, like, yes, you're allowed to do this research.
Very cool.
In this case, they were talking about how they originally had cohorts, which is groups of animals that they were testing. So in the final paper, they had groups of tiger barbs. They tested it with 1 individual, 5 individuals, and 8. The ethical note, they talk about how they had originally planned on cohorts with 2 individuals and 3 individuals. And they immediately scrapped that idea because the aggression was so high that they were scared that if someone from the ICOOT committee came in, they would pull their right to do the...
Wow.
Yeah. And
I
that's
can see
why
it.
we say they don't keep 3 tiger barbs together.
The next section is going to be the results. Most people can skim through this because this is going to be the densest part of the paper.
Okay.
This is going to be talking about their statistical analysis of their data, the math behind that, and what they came up to. When I say skim through it, there's going to be a lot of nice charts, and I think that's sufficient for most people.
Yeah.
If you have a slightly stronger base or you're nerdier like me, it's good to be able to go through that, and you can be like, what's their standard deviation? How strong is their data set? What's their data size?
Yeah.
The one thing I will ask people to look into in any paper they read is the sample size. A good sample size is like 20 or more, but realistically the average is probably around 12, but anything below like 6, I start getting like, okay. And then as a note to, let's talk about a slightly different but relevant topic these days. If you're looking at peer-reviewed medical research, if their sample size is below like 200, it's
No one's going to bother.
Yeah.
I'm not going to bother with
You've
it.
got to at least have context for what you're reading.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to shake out the anomalies.
Yes. Because, and that's a big deal between like animal science versus like human science, because it's easier to get people to volunteer into doing a research study for you.
Right.
Whereas with fish, they can't consent. So there's a lot of ethical things so that you have to overcome to do that, because you have to prove that you're not harming them, or if there's the potential to harm, you have to justify it pretty heavily.
Right.
They can't sign their names on a clipboard.
No. Oh yeah, and they have welfare scores for each group size in the study.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend that section in this paper, actually. And then the last.
Anything with a lot of charts is good. As soon as it gets to the words, my brain gets a little fuzzy.
I just like the pictures.
And then there's one more like written section, and that's the discussion. And that's for them basically expanding on the introduction, where they're like, okay, we've introduced the topic, this is the current science, we showed you our data, so what's the implications of our data and how does it formulate or coalesce, or does it change anything we know about how the science of this works?
Yeah.
And so I think for most people, if you're going to read like only parts of it and you don't want to get really, really techie and fine nitty-gritty, abstract, intro, discussion.
That makes perfect sense.
The last section is they will have a references or literature cited or bibliography, and that's, if you look through their paper, they're going to have citations. If you're curious about those specific topics and want to go back on them, they include all of that information so that you can backtrack and find those papers and do more research that way. At this point, I will say most papers I find are new papers I'm reading are in reference sections of papers I've already read.
That makes sense, because it's going to be already related to the topic you're researching at the time.
Yep. And that's really it. Some other things to keep in mind are they will have a conclusion, which can, some papers, which is like a brief like summary of their discussion. So, and then acknowledgements are kind of cool because it can give you an idea of, at least for someone like me, of what the political climate is in the institute that they're working in. So like when I did undergrad research, in my acknowledgements had a thank you to the guy who worked with crayfish in the building. And everyone, like, the reasoning, I was doing shark research and they're like, why are you thanking the crayfish guy? And it's because he loaned me some of his crayfish when I built my flow-through respirometers to calibrate that before I got sharks in.
That's awesome.
Very cool.
And so there's some really cool collaborations like that you just wouldn't innately think, oh, the crayfish guy is going to be the guy that helps me out in my shark research.
Like a little Easter egg at the end there. Yeah, it's fun.
I like it. Well, we all know that the source for accurate and thorough information and true information is such a huge challenge out there.
Yeah.
There's so much information available. Here's some great ways to find
and verify.
good and verify information.
And one thing I would keep in mind is that literature written by the person who did the research, that's called primary literature.
Okay.
Everything beyond that is secondary literature. So news media, that's secondary literature. The second you get into secondary literature, it becomes like a game of telephone, where like weird pickups can get added on. And in the podcast I mentioned the like news story about how like farts can help prevent cancer. And the scientist
Right.
who wrote that paper is still getting emails about that. And he's like, that was never a topic
Yeah.
discussed in my paper. Like, I don't get how that happened.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing to keep in mind where, like, if there's a news story and they cite a paper, I'll go back to that paper and read it and see how close they were. A lot of the time I'm disappointed. And that's one thing I want people to keep in mind when they're watching the news is that these are not scientists. And a lot of the time, like the perception that like scientists don't know what they're doing or like they're always changing their mind, that's not actually true. That's people who don't know how science works trying to tell other people how science works. And that's where things go wrong.
Yeah.
Well, check out Google Scholar.
Yeah.
Do some of those searches for those information. For that information.
Let me know if you find any cool papers you want me to read.
It's really fun to just play around with. Enter the scientific name of your favorite fish into Google
Yeah.
Scholar and see what comes up, and it's probably something pretty cool.
Yeah. So for anybody that doesn't have a Charles, this can be really, really useful information. We just make Charles do it, so he'll do it for you too.
Because he'll actually read the whole thing. I mean, come
I
on.
know.
Thanks, Charles. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And hey, have lots of fun and keep those hands wet.